It started with a letter taped to my front door. Bold red ink screaming noise, violation. The problem? I wasn't even home that night. While I was hundreds of miles away visiting family, my HOA decided to fine me for a disturbance they swore came from my house. Neighbors whispered, cameras were checked, and suddenly my reputation was on trial. But when the police got involved, the truth that surfaced didn't just clear my name. It shattered the entire HOA board's little empire of lies. So how did a simple noise complaint expose one of the biggest scams in our community's history? It started with a knock on my door just after sunrise. 3 HOA board members standing there, arms crossed, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. They accused me of hosting loud parties every night, disturbing the peace, and threatened me with thousands in fines. The strange part, I'd been out of town for a week. What followed was a storm of false reports, fake witnesses, and a twisted power play that nearly destroyed my reputation. But when I pulled the security footage and called the cops, everything the HOA thought they could hide came crashing down. So why were they so desperate to silence me? For years, my house had been my sanctuary, a quiet corner lot at the end of a manicured cul-de-sac, lined with blooming azaleas and trimmed hedges that the HOA loved to brag about in their monthly newsletter. It wasn't luxury, but it was peace, the kind you worked hard for. Every evening after work, I'd sit on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching kids ride their bikes, dogs chase tennis balls, and neighbors exchange polite waves before disappearing behind identical front doors. It was the picture of suburban calm, neat, orderly, predictable. Our homeowners association liked to take credit for that calm. They kept the lawns uniform, the trash cans hidden, and the paint colors community approved. Most people didn't question it. They paid their dues, nodded at the board meetings, and stayed out of trouble. But beneath that perfect surface was a quiet tension, the kind that only comes when a few people start to believe they have power over everyone else. At the center of it all was the HOA president, Karen Miller, retired real estate agent with an obsession for rules and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She had a clipboard for every occasion and a habit of patrolling the neighborhood like it was her personal kingdom. Her allies called her thorough. Everyone else called her the Hawk. Still, I tried to stay out of her way. I paid my dues on time, kept my yard immaculate, and followed every line in the HOA handbook. I didn't want trouble. I'd seen what happened to those who crossed Karen warnings slipped under doors. Anonymous complaints about unsightly clutter or sudden fines for things no one had ever heard of before. Life was quiet for the most part. I worked from home, spent weekends fixing up my garage, and tried to keep to myself. The HOA emails were just background noise, meeting notices, landscaping reminders, community updates that most people deleted before reading. Until one morning, something changed. A rumor started circulating in the neighborhood group chat. Someone had been throwing wild parties, blasting music late into the night. Nobody said names, but the tone was sharp, accusing. At first, I ignored it. But then, people started glancing my way a little too long when I drove by. I didn't think much of it until the first letter arrived, taped neatly to my front door. Bold red ink spelling out noise violation. I remember standing there on my porch, confused, holding that piece of paper like it was a bad joke. The letter said I'd been warned multiple times that this was my final notice, and that the HOA was issuing a $500 fine for repeated disturbances after midnight. But I hadn't even been home those nights. I'd been out of town visiting family 2 states away. That was the moment the peace I'd built started to crack. At first, I thought it was a misunderstanding. Maybe they'd mixed up addresses. Maybe some teenagers had used my driveway to hang out. But when I called the HOA to explain, I was met with an icy tone as if I'd just confessed to something. They told me the decision was final, that multiple witnesses had confirmed the noise came from my property, and if I didn't pay the fine within 10 days, they'd escalate the issue to legal action. It didn't make sense, None of it. But what I didn't know then was that this so-called noise violation wasn't just about sound. It was about control. Because in this neighborhood, rules weren't about keeping peace. They were about keeping power. And Karen was about to show just how far she'd go to protect hers. At first, I tried to handle it calmly. I sent an email to the HOA politely explaining that I hadn't been home during the dates listed on the violation notice. I even attached proof, a hotel receipt, time-stamped photos with my family, and my flight confirmation. I figured it would be cleared up in a few hours. But instead of an apology, I got silence. Days passed. Then, another letter appeared in my mailbox. This one colder, more official. It claimed I'd ignored previous warnings and that additional fines were being added for non-compliance. The total? $1,200. That's when I realized this wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. The neighborhood I once loved suddenly felt hostile. People who used to wave now avoided eye contact. A few whispered when I passed. Someone even posted a passive-aggressive message in the neighborhood. Facebook group. Some of us actually follow community rules and respect quiet hours. It was clear who had written it. Karen Miller, HOA president, self-appointed enforcer, and queen of thinly veiled attacks. She'd ruled the neighborhood for years, and most people were too afraid to push back. She knew how to use the HOA's rulebook like a weapon, vague noise policies, property appearance codes, even community standards clauses that let her fine anyone she wanted, whenever she wanted. Still, I refused to pay for something I didn't do. I wrote back to the HOA board demanding evidence, audio recordings, timestamps, anything that proved the alleged noise came from my house. The reply came 2 days later. Multiple residents confirmed disturbances originating from your property between 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. Evidence deemed sufficient. Sufficient for them, not for me. That's when I decided to start documenting everything. I printed every letter, screenshot every email, and began recording the dates and times Karen's car circled my street. Because she did every evening, like clockwork, driving slowly, jotting notes on her clipboard, stopping in front of certain homes longer than others. Then, strange things started happening. My trash cans were mysteriously dragged halfway down the block. Then, I'd receive a citation for bins not stored properly. A dead patch appeared on my lawn overnight, followed by another violation for neglecting yard maintenance. I began to feel watched, targeted, like someone was deliberately setting me up to fail. And when I tried to talk to a few neighbors, I saw the fear in their eyes. One man lowered his voice and said, "Don't get on her bad side. She'll make your life miserable." Then he quietly shut his door. By the third week, the fines had reached over $2,000. The HOA threatened to put a lien on my house if I didn't pay immediately. That's when I knew this had gone too far. I called an HOA attorney. After hearing my story, he told me something that changed everything. If you can prove you weren't home and that their claims were fabricated, you might have a harassment case. But you'll need hard evidence, police reports, security footage, something indisputable. That word footage stuck with me. I remembered my security cameras. I hadn't checked them in weeks, but they'd been recording the entire time. When I pulled up the footage, what I found made my stomach twist. At 11:37 p.m. on one of the nights, I was supposedly hosting loud parties. My driveway lights flicked on, not from my car, but from a silver SUV idling across the street. The driver's side door opened. Out stepped Karen, clipboard in hand. She stood there for nearly 10 minutes, pointing her phone at my house, then drove off. The next morning, I got another fine. That was my proof, but I wanted more. I began checking all the dates listed in the violation letters. Every single night, that same SUV appeared on camera, parked somewhere near my house. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. Once, she even walked onto my lawn. It was harassment, plain and simple. I sent the footage to the HOA board with a formal complaint, copying every member. I thought this would end it. Surely, when they saw their president trespassing on my property, they'd take action. Instead, they accused me of spying on board members and violating community privacy standards. That's when I realized the board wasn't a group of neighbors trying to maintain order. It was Karen's personal network, her friends, her enablers. They weren't going to hold her accountable. They were going to protect her. Still, I wasn't backing down. I decided to go to the police. When I explained the situation, the officer seemed skeptical at first, until I showed him the footage. He leaned forward, replayed the clip, and raised an eyebrow. "You said you were out of town during this?" he asked. I nodded. He made a few notes, then said, "We'll look into this. Keep your recordings safe." The next day, 2 officers came to the neighborhood. They started asking questions, quiet, routine, but noticeable. And suddenly, Karen wasn't smiling anymore. That evening, she sent a mass email to all residents, claiming someone had made false allegations against her and that certain individuals were trying to destabilize the community. It was a desperate attempt to regain control. But the damage was done. Whispers started again, this time about her. People who once feared her began talking. One neighbor mentioned how he'd been fined for excessive car washing. Another said Karen had threatened to report her for having too many lawn decorations. The stories poured out, one after another. For the first time, I wasn't alone. But Karen wasn't finished. A few days later, I woke up to a pounding on my door. 2 police officers stood there, holding a complaint. Someone had reported me for disorderly conduct, supposedly loud noises coming from my property again the night before. Except this time, I had video proof showing I'd been asleep inside. Lights off, everything silent. I invited the officers in, played the footage, and watched their expressions shift from suspicion to disbelief. They left shaking their heads, saying they'd handle it. Hours later, Karen's SUV disappeared from the street. That should have been the end of it, but instead, it triggered something bigger. The next morning, I found a notice posted on the HOA bulletin board, an emergency meeting to discuss community misconduct. My name wasn't mentioned, but everyone knew what it was about. I showed up anyway, with every email, letter, and video clip neatly printed in a folder. The room was tense. Karen sat at the head of the table, surrounded by her board members, her voice calm but trembling beneath the surface. She began with a speech about maintaining standards and preserving harmony. Then she turned her attention to me, calling my behavior defamatory and disruptive. I waited until she finished, then stood up and slid my folder across the table. Inside, timestamps, screenshots, security footage, stills, everything. The room went silent as one board member flipped through the evidence, his eyes widening. "Karen," he finally said, "is this true?" For the first time, her confidence cracked. Her lips tightened. She tried to speak, but the words stumbled. The rest of the room erupted questions, whispers, angry murmurs. Homeowners who'd been silent for years suddenly found their voices. Someone asked why fines were being issued without proof. Another demanded an audit of the HOA's finances. Karen tried to regain control, but the tide had turned. The same rules she'd used to control everyone were now being used against her. That night, I went home exhausted, but relieved. For the first time in weeks, it felt like justice might finally be coming. But even then, I knew this wasn't over. Because when someone like Karen loses power, they don't go quietly. They fight. And judging by the glare she gave me as I left that meeting, she wasn't done yet. What I didn't know then was that the next move she'd make would bring the police and the entire neighborhood to my doorstep once again. and this time there would be no denying the truth. The night everything came crashing down started with flashing lights. Red and blue reflected off the windows, slicing through the calm of the cul-de-sac like a warning. I remember standing at my front door, barefoot, heart pounding, as 2 police cruisers rolled to a stop in front of my house. Neighbors peeked through blinds and cracked open doors. Within minutes, the entire street was watching. I had no idea what was happening. Again, an officer stepped out and asked if I was the homeowner in question. Before I could even answer, Karen appeared as if she'd been waiting for this moment. Clipboard clutched to her chest, lips pressed tight in a look of self-righteous satisfaction. She told the officers I'd been caught again, violating community noise ordinances and aggressively confronting a board member. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. But she spoke with the kind of confidence that comes from years of getting her way. The officers glanced at each other, then at me. "Ma'am, we've received multiple complaints tonight," one said. Apparently, there was shouting, loud music, and possible threats made. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was unreal. "Officer," I said, "you're welcome to come in. You won't find a single thing out of place." I did. They walked through every room, checking corners, listening, scanning. Nothing. Silence. Not even a TV on. When they returned to the porch, one of them looked more confused than before. "That's what I thought," I said, handing him my phone. "You should see this." I pulled up the security feed from that very moment. The camera above my garage had captured everything. Karen standing at the edge of my property with her phone raised, pretending to record noise that didn't exist. You could see her mouthing words, shaking her head, even glancing nervously at the parked cars. The officer's expression hardened. "When was this taken?" "About 10 minutes before you arrived." They exchanged a look. Then one of them turned toward Karen, who was now fidgeting with her clipboard. "Ma'am, can we talk to you for a second?" Her face drained of color. The officer asked her to step aside. For the next 5 minutes, I watched from my porch as the calm, composed HOA president, the woman who'd spent weeks tormenting me, stumbled through excuses. Her voice rose, hands fluttering as she tried to explain away the footage. The officer interrupted her twice. Then, finally, he pointed to the street and said something I couldn't hear, but I didn't need to. Because a few seconds later, she turned and walked away. No clipboard. No smug expression. Just silence. It should have felt like victory. But what came next turned relief into something bigger, something explosive. The next morning, I got a call from the police department. They'd reviewed my complaint, the footage, and the timeline of events. Based on what they found, they were opening an investigation into potential harassment and filing a formal report. When word spread through the neighborhood, it was like a spark in dry grass. Everyone was talking about Karen, about the HOA, about the lies that had built up for years. For the first time, people weren't whispering out of fear. They were angry. An emergency community meeting was called. This time by the vice president of the HOA, someone who'd previously stayed quiet under Karen's shadow. It was held in the clubhouse on a Saturday afternoon. Nearly every homeowner showed up. The air inside was thick with tension. Karen sat at the front table, avoiding eye contact, while murmurs filled the room. The vice president stood and announced the reason for the meeting. There have been serious concerns about misconduct and misuse of authority within this board. You could feel the shift in the air. The silence that followed wasn't respect, it was anticipation. Then he turned to me. "Would you like to present your evidence?" I stepped forward, holding a small flash drive. My hands were steady now. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about truth. The footage played on the projector for everyone to see. Karen pacing outside my home, recording fake videos, slipping papers onto my door in the middle of the night. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Then came the second clip. Her SUV parked across from my house, lights off, watching. Then another, her walking onto my property. When the final clip ended, the room was silent. Karen tried to stand, stammering something about context and false accusations, but nobody believed her anymore. One of the board members, a man who'd been her ally for years, stood up and said, "Enough. You've gone too far." What happened next felt like the unraveling of an empire. Homeowners began stepping forward, one by one, sharing their own experiences, fines for invisible violations, threats of liens, intimidation tactics. It was as if years of frustration had finally found a voice. People were angry, emotional, trembling as they spoke. And through it all, Karen sat frozen. Her control, her confidence, gone. The vice president called for a vote of no confidence. Hands shot up across the room. Every single member of the board, except Karen, voted in favor of her immediate removal. The crowd erupted in applause. But even that wasn't the final twist. As the room began to settle, the police officer who'd handled my case walked in. He'd been invited to observe, but when he took the microphone, the atmosphere changed again. He announced that based on evidence collected, the HOA president was now under investigation for harassment and falsifying reports. A collective gasp filled the space. Karen's face went white. The officer explained that she'd used her position to target residents unfairly, fabricating violations and filing false noise complaints. The HOA would be required to cooperate fully, and she was officially suspended pending the investigation's outcome. She stood up, shaking her head, trying to argue, but her voice cracked. The same people who once feared her now looked at her with disgust. Some even turned away. The moment she left that room, red-faced, clutching her clipboard like it could still protect her, was the moment everything shifted. The power she'd wielded so carelessly had finally collapsed under its own weight. After the meeting, neighbors I'd barely spoken to before came up to me, shaking my hand, thanking me. They admitted they'd been afraid to speak up, that they'd seen what she'd done but didn't want to be next. Now, with her gone, it felt like the neighborhood was breathing for the first time in years. But the real victory came a week later. The police report became public record. It detailed every action, the harassment, the false complaints, the misuse of HOA authority. And as word spread, other residents started coming forward with their own proof, letters, fines, screenshots. The board, now restructured under temporary leadership, launched a full audit. What they found was staggering: unauthorized expenses, misused funds, and dozens of unjustified citations issued under Karen's signature. She hadn't just abused her power, she'd built an entire system of control around it. It all came crashing down in the span of a few weeks. The HOA formally removed her from her position, issued a public apology to affected homeowners, and voided every fine she'd ever issued without proper evidence. Legal proceedings began soon after. For the first time in months, my mailbox was empty. No warnings, no fines, no threats. Just silence. Real silence. And yet, that night, as I stood on my porch and looked out across the street, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just my story. This wasn't just about one woman with too much authority. It was about how fragile peace can be when people let fear take root. Because the truth is, the HOA didn't just create Karen, they enabled her. They gave her power without question until someone finally refused to be quiet. That was the turning point. Not just for me, but for everyone who'd ever felt trapped under the weight of someone else's control. As the last of the police lights faded from the street that night, I realized something. Peace doesn't come from rules or committees. It comes from standing your ground when no one else will. And for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood finally felt free. But what none of us expected, what came next, would show just how deep her influence had gone, and how hard it would be to rebuild trust once the truth was out. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood entered a strange calm, the kind that comes only after a storm has passed, but the sky still feels heavy with what it left behind. The once fearful cul-de-sac, the same street where whispers replaced greetings and letters replaced decency, began to breathe again. For the first time in years, people opened their windows. Children played in front yards without parents glancing nervously down the street for a patrolling SUV. Even the air felt different, lighter, freer, like the weight of control had finally lifted. But peace didn't come instantly. The HOA board had collapsed in chaos after Karen's removal. Months of emails, complaints, and hidden records had to be untangled. The vice president, now acting president, organized open meetings for the first time in the community's history. Residents packed into the clubhouse, some still angry, others just curious. All of them trying to understand how one person had managed to hold so much power for so long. The first meeting was unlike anything the neighborhood had seen before. Gone were the formalities, the scripted agendas, the cold enforcement tone. Instead, homeowners stood up and spoke, really spoke, about their experiences. One woman broke down as she described being fined for having a disabled parking tag visible in her driveway. Another man admitted he'd paid thousands in bogus maintenance fees because he'd been too afraid to argue. Each story peeled back another layer of what Karen had built, a system of fear disguised as community order. The board's internal audit confirmed what everyone suspected. Karen had fabricated multiple violations, manipulated board votes, and funneled HOA funds into consulting services that led straight to her personal accounts. It wasn't just abuse of power, it was fraud. When the full report went public, the shockwaves were felt far beyond our subdivision. Local news stations picked up the story. Headlines read, HOA president under investigation for harassment and fraud. Residents speak out. Seeing our quiet little neighborhood on TV felt surreal. For months, I'd lived in isolation, convinced my fight was just about one unfair fine. But now, the entire community was standing beside me. Karen's downfall didn't happen overnight. The investigation took time, but eventually, charges were filed: harassment, falsifying reports, misuse of association funds. The very clipboard she used to intimidate people became Exhibit A in the case against her. She was ordered to pay restitution, and her real estate license, the badge of her self-proclaimed authority, was permanently revoked. When the news broke, some people celebrated. Others just sighed, weary from it all. For me, it was closure, not revenge, just relief. But the real transformation wasn't in the headlines. It was in how the neighborhood changed afterward. The new HOA board rebuilt from scratch, rewrote almost every bylaw. Every fine now required documented evidence and a majority vote. Meetings were recorded and shared publicly. Residents could review budgets, question expenses, and even veto policies through online voting. What was once a tool of oppression became, slowly, a framework for fairness. And for the first time, people began to trust again. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years started helping each other. The man who used to keep his garage door closed all day now waved whenever I passed. Families gathered on lawns for barbecues without worrying about being in violation. We even had a neighborhood cleanup event, something that hadn't happened since Karen took office. The laughter, the casual conversations, the sense of togetherness, it all felt foreign at first. But it grew naturally, like something we'd all been missing without realizing it. One afternoon, as I was trimming the hedges along my driveway, an older neighbor walked up and said quietly, "You did what we were all too scared to do." I didn't feel like a hero. I hadn't set out to fight anyone. I just wanted peace. But maybe that's how these battles always start, with one person refusing to bow when everyone else has. Still, there were scars left behind. Trust doesn't rebuild easily after years of fear. Some homeowners still check their mailboxes with a flicker of anxiety, half expecting another notice to appear. Others struggled to forgive themselves for staying silent. And I understood that feeling because I'd been silent once too. But healing was happening. Slowly, steadily. The HOA even established a community oversight committee, an idea born from everything we'd endured. It wasn't just a group of volunteers. It was a promise that no one person would ever hold unchecked power again. Every new board member had to sign a transparency pledge, and any resident could attend budget meetings. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Meanwhile, I found myself drawn into something unexpected. People from nearby communities began reaching out, asking how we'd done it, how we'd challenged the system without losing everything. Some had their own Karens, their own HOA nightmares. I shared what I'd learned. Document everything. Stay calm. Never let them intimidate you. And most of all, don't fight alone. Because that's the truth. These kinds of battles aren't really about noise violations or lawn colors or fence heights. They're about power, about control, about what happens when ordinary people forget that their voice actually matters. And once you remember that, they lose their grip. Months later, I got one final letter from the HOA. This time, it wasn't a warning or a fine. It was an invitation to join the board. I almost laughed when I opened it. The irony wasn't lost on me. After everything I'd been through, the last thing I wanted was to be part of the system that had nearly broken me. But then I thought about it, and I realized maybe that's exactly why I should. So I accepted. At the next meeting, I sat in the same seat Karen once claimed as her throne. But the energy was different now. Open, collaborative, human. We weren't there to police lawns or count decibels. We were there to protect the peace we'd fought to reclaim. Every time a new issue came up, a parking dispute, a broken fence, a noise complaint, I made sure of one thing. We talked with the homeowner, not at them. Because that's how it should have been all along. And as the months passed, the story that once divided our neighborhood became something else entirely, a reminder. A reminder of what happens when people let fear silence them. A reminder of how quickly power can corrupt and how much courage it takes to stand up to it. A reminder that even in the smallest corners of suburbia, justice still matters. Looking back now, it's almost strange how something as small as a fake noise violation could unravel so much. It started with one letter on my door, a few lines of red ink meant to intimidate. But that letter pulled a thread, and by the time it was over, the entire web of lies had come undone. Sometimes the smallest act of resistance, asking for proof, refusing to sign, demanding fairness, is all it takes to expose something much bigger. And that's the thing about truth. You can cover it, twist it, bury it under fear and rules and paperwork, but it doesn't disappear. It waits, and the moment someone shines a light on it, even the most powerful facade starts to crumble. Karen's name is no longer spoken much around here. When it is, it's usually followed by a sigh or a shake of the head. People still remember her SUV parked under the streetlight, her clipboard, her rules. But now, she's more of a cautionary tale than a threat. And as for me, life finally went back to normal. Real normal. Quiet mornings, unbothered evenings. The kind of peace that doesn't come with fear attached. Every time I hear laughter from the park or see kids racing down the street, I'm reminded of what we almost lost and how close it came to slipping away because of one person's ego. But we got it back. And if there's one thing this whole ordeal taught me, it's that sometimes the fight for peace isn't loud or dramatic. It's quiet, steady, patient. It's standing your ground even when your voice shakes. Because peace isn't just the absence of noise, it's the presence of fairness, respect, and courage. And that's something no HOA rulebook can ever take away. So when I look at that same front porch, the one where it all began, where that first letter once fluttered in the breeze, I can finally smile. Because that was the day I learned that even in the most controlled communities, true order doesn't come from rules. It comes from people brave enough to question them.